I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To discuss the recent developments in the Ukraine-Russia war and all the diplomacy surrounding it, I have with us one of my favorite all-time guests on the podcast, a friend of the podcast, Dr. Seth Jones, who is president of CSIS's Defense and Security Department. He's also our Harold Brown Chair at CSIS. Seth, welcome back.
Andrew, it is always a pleasure to be on, but I'm guessing you say that to all your guests. So.
You know, when they're our colleagues, it's hard not to.
Okay.
You know, because we've got such a good bunch here.
I'm still flattered. I'm flattered.
Well, you are a friend of the podcast. There's no question. We're talking we're talking March 5th. We're talking early afternoon. Things are really developing. I feel like we need to date the podcast a bit because who knows what could happen in the next few hours. There's a lot going on. Let's first talk about the news today. CIA Director John Ratcliffe and also National Security Advisor Mike Waltz both said that the United States has paused intelligence support to Ukraine for the moment. That could severely hurt Ukraine out in the battlefield. Tell us why you think they did this and what are the consequences of it?
Well, I think people are very aware of the military assistance that the U.S. and other countries, including the Europeans, have provided. The U.S. has also provided, along with some others, some training to Ukrainian forces and certainly did that before the full-scale invasion in 2022. But the U.S. has also provided intelligence to Ukraine that Ukraine is used for, in part, targeting Russian forces. It could be the location of specific structures in Russia. It could be the location of key Russian military units operating in Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine, key logistics areas, radar systems. U.S. intelligence has been absolutely essential, including with things like the movement of North Korean forces into Russia. U.S. has hands down the best collection of intelligence in the world. Those capabilities include cyber, so NSA and signals intelligence. They include all of the satellite intelligence collection that the U.S. can pick up from airborne sensors. All of those capabilities can be very useful to the Ukrainians to prosecute the war. So turning them off and stopping providing some of them at this moment is really damaging for the Ukrainians.
And so, for practical purposes, and this intelligence gathering also, it has a direct result. Ukraine uses it to target, the Russians. Isn't that correct?
This has an impact on the Ukrainian ability to conduct operations. Now, it is possible and likely that the Ukrainians will get help from European countries. The British have capabilities based out of MI6 and GCHQ. That's the British Cyber Agency. There are other European countries that do have intelligence collection capabilities. I'm just not convinced that the Ukrainians can make up the difference with the loss, at least for the moment, of the U.S.'s massive technical and other intelligence capabilities.
Seth, this is a related question, but it's somewhat separate. Yesterday it was reported, and there's some mixed reporting on this, that the United States has suspended all offensive cyber capabilities against Russia. That seemed like not necessarily a correct report, hard to believe if true. Where do you come off on this?
Well, I think if it is true that the U.S. has stopped conducting offensive cyber operations against the Russians, it would be deeply troubling. I mean, at this point, the Russians really haven't given up anything in the Ukraine discussions. They're still pushing for Zelensky to step down. They're still pushing for Ukraine not to be admitted into NATO. They're still pushing for a range of other things, including Ukraine to get deneutered militarily. And at the same time, the Russians continue to collaborate with the Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Iranians. So they continue to do what they've been doing, strengthening relationship with a bunch of adversaries of the United States, and yet they've been rewarded.
Well, and, this is interesting because all of this comes against the backdrop of a pretty disastrous Oval Office meeting last week between President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. They met, everyone's seen it, video's kind of viral. President Trump himself said it made for good TV, but I think it unsettled a lot of people as well. What was your take and what's the fallout?
Well, look, we're in the middle of negotiations, and Ukraine is in a position that is understandable. In 1994, as part of the Budapest memorandums, a series of agreements, the Ukrainians had given up their nuclear weapons in return for security guarantees from the Russians, the Americans, and some other countries. And they gave up their nuclear deterrent. If you fast forward to 2014, the Russians salami-sliced Ukraine. They took Crimea. Then they proceeded to bring in their special operations and intelligence forces into eastern Ukraine, start a war in the Donbass. Then they eventually put in Russian conventional units. Around the same time, 2014 through 2022, they conducted heavy offensive cyber operations targeting the critical infrastructure of Ukraine. And then they enacted a full-scale invasion of the country and tried to overthrow Zelensky and the Ukrainian government. So you can't blame Zelensky in that context for wanting security guarantees. And just to be crystal clear about this, economic guarantees, U.S. access to minerals, is not the same thing as a security guarantee. If I were sitting in Kyiv right now in the president's office, economic guarantees mean nothing if you have a foreign government, one of the largest militaries in the world in Russia, that is still committed to overthrowing your government, whose leader, Vladimir Putin, continues to say, he's in print saying this, that he does not recognize Ukraine as a sovereign entity. It is part of Russia. For all of those things, it is very understandable that Zelensky is worried. And it's just not reflected in any senior U.S. officials' statements and awareness of the bind that Zelensky has been in. And just two more just brief comments about this. I think it's actually remarkable how well the Ukrainians have done against one of the top militaries in the world. They have fought them really to a standstill right now.
I mean, the Russians have taken on 600,000 casualties. They're still at it in full force. They're not backing down.
Yeah. Actually, our numbers are closer to 800,000 casualties.
800,000.
That the Russians have taken, including almost 200,000 fatalities, which is like 5 times the number of all Russians killed in wars between 1945 and February of 2022. So the Ukrainians are doing a lot better than people are giving them credit for, and the Russians are doing a lot worse. They cannot maneuver. They are stuck in attrition warfare. They're losing in large numbers. They bring in the North Koreans because they don't want to mobilize forces. And the North Koreans suffer anywhere between 1/3 and 50% casualties as well. So, the idea that Ukrainians have no cards and the Russians have all the cards is just factually not true. The Russians have suffered dramatically. Their economy is in tough shape as well. So the Russians have a lot to lose if this war continues and they suffer the casualties that they've done. So none of this was really, I don't think, recognized both before, during, and even after that meeting.
So the meeting fallout continued until yesterday when President Zelensky posted a tweet saying that it was time to get back to the negotiating table, that he is very grateful. President Trump mentioned it in his address last night to the Congress. Where do you think we go from here, Seth? I mean, the Trump administration's adamant there needs to be a deal and a deal fast. And Ukraine is adamant, as you said before, that they need security guarantees. And the economic return the United States would get from the minerals deal, by the way, our colleague Gracelyn Bascarin wrote yesterday in an op-ed in the New York Times that the United States isn't going to realize any economic gains from that for at least over 18 years, if in fact there are the rare earth minerals that we think are there, because we're going on past, geological surveys that are decades old.
And in addition to that, Andrew, there is every indication that this war will continue in some form or fashion for this foreseeable future. I would remind folks that in 1994, Russia wages war in Chechnya. It doesn't perform that well, so it pauses in 1996, uses a peace deal to rearm, and then goes back at it in 1999 and continues for another 10 years. So under Putin, again, it is critical to understand Putin has said this repeatedly. He does not recognize Ukraine as a sovereign entity. He views it as part of Russia, imperial Russia. He hearkens on the legacy of Peter the Great in highlighting Ukraine's existence within inside of Mother Russia. So I think every indication here is that in order for companies to come in and start to extract the minerals, you need peace over years. And I just think every indication from what we're hearing, particularly from Moscow, I just don't think that's likely. So, yeah, it certainly sounds good, but it's nothing that certainly the Trump administration is ever going to see while it's in office.
Well, and Graceland's point in her op-ed was that the United States does need minerals for national security, but it needs to develop a broad strategy for minerals. Considering, as you just said, companies going in there to mine, according to Graceland, it's a $500 million to $1 billion initial investment just to get it going. So what company is going to invest that kind of money if there is no peace?
Yes. And so this really means that it's the security guarantees that are going to matter at the end of the day. And so what we're looking at right now is, I think, a very stark realization from a number of European countries led by the British and the French to begin to put together a plan to provide weapons as well as deploy potentially peacekeepers into Ukraine as part of a security guarantee. But I will tell you, without U.S. involvement in any way, there is definitely a risk in this deal to World War III. Because without U.S. involvement in any way, shape, or form, I worry that the Russians are going to use this as an opportunity to conduct strikes. We already know that the Russians have been willing to conduct various types of attacks in both France and the UK. Andrew, we have pulled together a database of Russian clandestine and covert activity, and it highlights a tripling between 2023 and 2024 of Russian, primarily GRU, that's the main intelligence directorate, acts of subversion and sabotage, including on British and French soil. So
this is a new report you're coming
This
out
is a
with.
new report.
So you're previewing it here.
We're previewing it here. And so I think there is certainly a possibility that the Russians conduct various types of operations against European forces on Ukrainian soil. The Russians would be, I think, deterred with a U.S. presence there. But without a U.S. presence, I think we're seriously risking an escalation.
And so, we've heard from people at the Munich Security Conference, we've heard from our European allies, they're hell-bent on forging ahead and supporting Ukraine, as you just said. They're very concerned the United States is going to pull out of NATO and not be part of this 80-year-plus alliance that we've had that's kept us all safe. What's your take there?
Yeah, we'll have to see. I mean, I think one of the great things about the U.S. presence in Europe has been that it has prevented a World War III on the continent. The U.S. was not there leading up to World War I, was not there leading up to World War II, but the U.S. has been there since World War II as a way to pacify another conventional war in Europe. So really the removal of the U.S. from NATO would significantly increase the possibility of major war on the European continent. The biggest thing that I really have trouble understanding is what appears to be a shift in policy towards Moscow. And the reality is that Russia remains, from Russia's perspective, a major adversary of the United States. When you look at everything they're doing right now, from offensive cyber operations against U.S. targets, they continue to plant malware in U.S. critical infrastructure.
Influence elections.
They've influenced elections. I think what's also important is that they continue to have by far their strongest relationship with Xi Jinping. Putin and Xi Jinping have met nearly 60 times. In February 2025, just recently, the two countries met yet again. This was Sergei Shoigu and then Xi Jinping. As Xi Jinping says to Shoigu, the two countries are, quote, true friends like steel repeatedly tempered by fire.
Strong statement.
Very strong statement. And as part of that, the Chinese have backed it up. They're providing significant amounts of military supplies to Russia right now. They're buying Russian oil. It's a very strong strategic relationship. The Russians also have something similar with the Iranians. The Iranians are building Shaheeds, these are drones, on Russian soil. And then in addition, the Russians have also brought in rockets, various types of artillery, and even soldiers from North Korea. So Russia has not shifted its policy with this axis of autocracies. So why are we giving them any benefit of the doubt? Their relationship with these countries is strong. It's deeply concerning that the U.S. is somehow trusting a country that is so deeply in bed with the Chinese, the Iranians, and the North Koreans. I find it very difficult to understand the rationale there.
Yeah, a lot of people are having those same questions. And, you just outlined this very clearly. Where do you think the United States goes from here in terms of this policy? Because as you said, they're working with our adversaries, if not our enemies. And the United States is saying we want to have a relationship with Russia. Under those terms, how can we have a relationship with Russia?
Well, it is possible. I think the challenge is a closer relationship with Russia has huge second and third order effects. One is in Europe, where the Europeans are deeply concerned. Finland, Poland, the Baltic states, anybody whose country borders Russia or Belarus.
If you talk to the Estonians, the terror is palpable.
Understandable. Putin has made inroads in the Baltic states. These are former Soviet countries.
Yes.
Putin wants them back in Russia's sphere of influence and potentially in Russian territory. So one is it's clearly moving in a very different direction from some of the U.S.'s historic democratic allies in Europe. The second is it's already reverberating across Asia right now. Andrew, I was in Taiwan to see Taiwan's leadership 2 weeks ago, and they are very nervous about the U.S. shift towards Russia, in part because it's an about face. The future of Ukraine is now being debated between Moscow and Washington without the Ukrainians even at the table. This has huge potential implications for the future of Taiwan and whether the U.S. is even interested at all in Taiwan. And as the PLA continues to conduct really rehearsals, not even exercises, around the island, I think the South Koreans now are asking these big questions about to what degree can they rely on the U.S. and the Japanese as well.
The South Koreans are talking about developing their own nuclear program.
Absolutely. When you start to wonder whether the U.S. is going to be there for you and whether the U.S. is going to keep its troops within your country, and if you're South Korea, you've got a North Korea with nuclear weapons, and you've got China that is building up to 1,000 nuclear weapons by the end of this decade, then you're really only reliant. Your only step forward if you can't trust the U.S. is to build your own nuclear arsenal. Same thing with the Japanese. So this has the potential to increase nuclear proliferation across several regions, including Asia. So, this has the potential to reverberate across the international landscape.
Second and third order consequences, indeed. Seth, you mentioned your forthcoming report. Can you tell us more about it? Why you undertook this study?
Yeah, so there's been some newspaper reports on Russian sabotage and subversive acts against European and U.S. targets in Europe. It's been bigger than that. It's been global, but predominantly in Europe. But these are just kind of single incident reports. What we decided to do is build a database of Russian activity. And what we found is there is a gigantic escalation of Russia's sabotage and subversion campaign against both U.S. and European targets in Europe. It's led by Russian military intelligence, the GRU. By our count, the number of Russian attacks roughly tripled between 2023 and 2024. The targets that the Russians have hit have been critical infrastructure, undersea fiber optic cables.
They're cutting cables.
They're blowing up depots at various defense companies in Europe. They're conducting assassinations in various locations. And the main tactics and weapons they're using are explosives. And in a few cases, like the cable cutting, they're using anchors from ships and a lot of electronic attack, including cyber operations. It's a really significant, very aggressive action that the Russians are conducting, and it has not gotten the public attention that it needs and deserves because nobody's put the data together. So that's really what we're trying to do. What it does show is it highlights the Russian threat.
Yeah. And so this is going to come out in about a week or so, I believe, and we'll have it up on the CSIS website, csis.org. Seth, is there anything else you can tell us about some of the sabotage? You mentioned the sabotage. I actually want to ask about the subversion. What is that?
Well, what we see is that the Russians have conducted a range of activities with their intelligence services, providing assistance to political parties across Europe. They're also involved in a heavy disinformation campaign designed to break apart NATO. And in a sense, they're having some effect along those lines. In addition, we see them involved in a range of activities to assassinate individuals. One of the most fascinating cases, Andrew, is the serious assassination plot against the CEO of Rheinmetall, the German company, which has provided some assistance, including military assistance, to Ukraine. It's one of the few cases we have, and it really shows the aggressiveness of Russian actions.
And that's something that's been widely underreported.
It's been underreported. It's one of the few cases we have where the Russians have conducted an assassination plot against someone that's not a Russian defector, because that's been pretty typical. If you defect from the Russian security services, they're going to come after you in Europe. We've seen them do it in the UK. We saw them assassinate a Russian defector in Spain over the last year or so. But a foreigner, in this case a German citizen,
who's a CEO of a company.
This kind of highlights the new way and the aggressive nature that the Russians are getting just below the threshold of conventional war.
Seth, we've given us a lot to think about, and I want to have you back after you put the report out to dissect it further. But thanks so much for all this perspective. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, as always, Andrew. Really appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.